This episode is brought to you by Thorn, and I have some incredible news for any of you that are in the military, first responder, or medical professions. In an effort to give back, Thorn is now offering you an ongoing 25% off each and every one of your purchases of their incredible nutritional solutions. Now, Thorn is the official supplement of CrossFit, the UFC, the Mayo Clinic, the Human Performance Project, and multiple special operations organizations. I myself have used them for several years, and that is why I brought them on as a sponsor. Some of my favorite products they have are their Multivitamin Elite, their Whey Protein, the Super EPA, and then most recently, Cinequil. As a firefighter, a stuntman, and a martial artist, I've had my share of brain trauma and sleep deprivation, and Cinequil is their latest brain health supplement. Now, to qualify for the 35% off, go to thorn.com, thorne.com. Click on sign in and then create a new account. You will see the opportunity to register as a first responder or member of military. When you click on that, it will take you through verification with GovX. You'll simply choose a profession, provide one piece of documentation, and then you are verified for life. From that point onwards, you will continue to receive 35% off through Thorn. Now, for those of you who don't qualify, there is still the 10% off using the code BTS10, Behind the Shield 10, for a one-time purchase. Now, to learn more about Thorn, go to episode 323 of the Behind the Shield podcast with Joel Totoro and Wes Barnett. Welcome to episode 1100 of the Behind the Shield podcast. As always, my name's James Gearing. And this very special episode, I brought on an incredible guest for you. Losing an uncle from a line of duty death, Kellie O'Dare was driven into the research world and ultimately found herself working within the fire service. Her husband, Brandon, is a firefighter, and she is now one of our top researchers as well as the founder of Second Alarm Project. So we discuss a host of topics, from Sean's line of duty death, her journey into the world of research, the dangers of myopic studies, UCF Restores, the Struggle Well program, the 2472 study that they're embarking on at the moment, and so much more. Now, before we get to this incredible conversation, as I say every week, please just take a moment. Go to whichever app you listen to this on, subscribe to the show, leave feedback, and leave a rating. Every single 5-star rating truly does elevate this podcast, therefore making it easier for others to find. And this is a free library of exactly 1100 episodes. So all I ask in return is that you help share these incredible men and women's stories so I can get them to every single person on planet Earth who needs to hear them. So with that being said, I introduce to you Kellie O'Dare. Enjoy. Well, Kellie, I want to start by saying thank you so much for taking the time and coming on the Behind the Shield podcast today.
Thank you for having me. Really excited to be here, James, and to share our information with your listeners.
Absolutely. Now, I had the honor of meeting both of you when we kind of hosted a panel on 2472, which I'm sure we'll get into, for the Florida Fire Chiefs Association conference a few months ago. But you and I didn't really get to talk because you had lost your voice then. So I think this is the first time we're going to have a full conversation.
Yes, that's right. I had forgotten about that, but I did. It was the craziest thing the day before. You know, you have a big presentation for your voice to just cut out is not the best timing. But fortunately, I had wonderful colleagues who were able to jump in and help me make it through that whole presentation.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Well, I would love to start at the very beginning of your journey, because I know there's a lot of kind of fire service interaction from previous generations all the way through. So tell me where you were born and tell me a little bit about your family dynamic, what your parents did, how many siblings.
Sure. So I was born in Plantation, Florida, which Your South Florida listeners will probably be familiar with where that is, but for those who aren't Florida natives or know where that is, it's Broward County, Florida. So not quite to Miami-Dade, but in Broward County. And we kind of lived a couple different places, sort of moving our way north, up into the Treasure Coast area, and ended up calling home where I spent the most of my formative years in Vero Beach in Indian River County. So when I say home, where my home is, I consider that one of the places. Grew up and graduated high school there, and ended up going to Tallahassee to go to Florida State University, go Noles, and ended up doing all of my degrees at FSU. So I also really consider Tallahassee my home until very recently, very, very recently. We just actually moved to the Orlando area, relocated for my new position. Very exciting with UCF Restores. We also lived in Pensacola for a little while over on the West Coast. So I feel fortunate to have kind of experienced all of the different areas in Florida that Florida has to offer. But I was raised by a single mom, and I had 5 uncles. So fortunately for me, I was absent a biological father for the most part of my formative years, but I had people stepping in and stepping up to that role. And one of them was my uncle Sean O'Dare, and he was a Miami-Dade County firefighter who gave his life in the line of duty, rescuing a child who was trapped in a vehicle submerged in a canal. So my connection with the fire service started very young. And then, as you mentioned, fast forward, quite a few years later, I ended up marrying somebody who he had just started fire school when we met. So have been with him throughout the whole journey of fire school and being a new recruit all the way through to now being a company officer. And, he decided to also go to paramedic school in his 40s, which I don't know what he was thinking doing that or what I was thinking doing supporting that. But it's been a wild ride. And yes, the fire service has been very important to us and to our family, and has provided a lot for us. So I'm super grateful to be able to give back to the individuals who are also associated with these fire service organizations.
Did your husband go through medic school as part of a program within the department, or did he have to go outside of the department?
He was fortunate enough to go through within a department. So, that was, I think, a little bit of the heavy lift of it taken off.
Yeah, I went outside of mine. Mine was screaming for medics, Orange County at the time, and yet they weren't giving any support for anyone that went to medic school. It was bizarre. So I worked full time in Orange County, and then had to do my school and all my precepting when I was on off duty on other departments. So, and I was a single dad, so I can testify the immense weight that is paramedic school when you're already working.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Well, going back to your Uncle Sean, I worked for Hialeah Fire Department. That was my very first one, not too far.
Okay.
I lived in Pines, so just close to the plantation. And we did dive rescue because we had the canals everywhere. So I would imagine that the training that I got on Hialeah in 2004 was partly a ripple effect of what happened to your uncle.
It was absolutely. It kind of gave me chills to hear you say that, because my mom's whole family, she was born and raised in Hialeah back in the 50s and 60s. So she was kind of there. The O'Dares were Hialeah OGs from back in the day. And as I mentioned, we kind of like continued moving north, but that was really the starting place. And I think one of the reasons why my uncle decided to stay down there and work for Miami-Dade. But yes, so a lot of the dive rescue training and equipment and all of the different programs were influenced by his passing. And so that is definitely a point of pride, or a point of really post-traumatic growth for our family, and turning a tragedy and something like that into purpose after something like that happens.
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny, by the time I got there in 2004, there weren't very many Irish surnames that you heard in the patients that we ran on. They referred to either the Julios or the Johnnies as far as the firefighters. You're either a Hispanic guy, or mainly Cuban, or you were one of the minority hires, aka the white guys.
Right. Yeah, definitely the demographic has shifted. When I tell the local people that my family is originally from Hialeah, they kind of look at me sideways, like you don't look like you fit. But we did. That was home.
Yeah, no, it's beautiful. I actually just went and visited my old apartment just a few, like 2, 3 weeks ago, and stood in the training tower where I got murdered for 3 months. And it's so much nicer standing out there when you're not the recruit anymore. So,
Right.
all right. Well, then shifting back before we go into your journey even to FSU, firstly, from a sports point of view, what were you playing as far as activities and sports?
So I played dabbled in a little bit of basketball growing up, but I honestly I didn't really find my first love in sports until I was an adult. And even like a older adult, guy approaching midlife when I started doing a lot of running. I started doing tons of running, half marathons and marathons, and really liked that challenge, but I was a pretty terrible runner. I really wasn't fast. I really wasn't very good at it, but I did it, and it was something that I could set some goals and have some personal achievements over. But a couple of my running buddies got into this new thing called CrossFit, and so I decided to try that out. And fast forward like 10 years later, I was still doing it and loving it. And the Olympic weightlifting component was actually something that I did have a knack for, as opposed to running, which I didn't. Started doing a lot of competitions and really just embracing that lifestyle. So I would say I used to always say I was an adult onset athlete.
Do you still do CrossFit now?
So I dabble here and there. I had to kind of take it down a notch into my 40s. I couldn't be quite the fire breather that I feel like I wanted to be at one point in my early and mid 30s. Um, but I've discovered some other things that I try to do pretty regularly that I enjoy. Maybe not quite as much as the CrossFit, but things like Orange Theory and other kind of group fitness that's challenging.
I started one of my Anaheim firefighter friends got us into it. I think it was 2006 ish, so quite a long time ago, and had this really interesting journey where first he was showing us, and then moved back to Florida, and I'm in the YMCA doing it on my own, and everyone's looking at me like I've lost my fucking mind, because back then no one knew what it was, and then it got famous, the games started being on TV, and then these same people that were laughing at me are now asking, how do you do that? So interesting shift again. But then, as you said, like I got into, I mean, literally, it was like a year and a half ago. They changed the programming in my gym, and I was noticing that I'd kind of not even plateaued. Like I was starting to decline, and I wasn't. The whole point of the strength and conditioning program is that you hope that you keep getting a little bit stronger or maintaining at least. And so now we've got this thing called Wolf Brigade. So it's a lot more focus on like single arm, heavy kettlebell movements, maces,
Mm-hmm.
sandbags, sleds, and taking away that, as you said, that fire breathing element. There's still that cardiovascular part, but it's not like murder yourself almost every single day. Because even the main site wasn't that. It was really, of the 4 days, like one was actually supposed to be a kind of red line workout. And that has just been incredible. So still the exact same building, exact same members, but the programming has changed. And I find as now I don't even like to use the word middle age because my grandmother was 105 when she died, so I'm not quite middle yet, but
Yeah,
lower
that's
middle age. um,
years for good genes. That's fantastic.
yeah, exactly. So I owe it to her to have a good, healthy life. But yeah, so having just slowing it down a little bit, having those days where yeah, it really sucks and you are pushing it, but having a lot more of those stricter, heavier movements, I find certainly once you get past your kind of 20s, that serves you a lot better as a first responder, as a martial artist, than continuing to beat yourself down and kind of ignoring some of the imbalances that I found CrossFit was creating.
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I just couldn't agree more. And really, opportunity to tap into the mental health benefits that are associated with that type of physical training. I think, when you're beating yourself down constantly and you're not feeling good, it kind of takes away some of those benefits. So getting something that's a little more balanced and can provide a little more clarity, both mentally and physically, I think has been tremendously helpful, at least for me.
Absolutely. Well, what about from the career aspiration side? Again, kind of school age. What were you dreaming of becoming high school age?
Yeah, so interestingly enough, I wanted to be a firefighter when I even into high school. I really thought that that's what I was going to do. And as I mentioned, I was raised by a single mom, and she didn't have a college education. She had a high school education, and did secretarial work for most of her career. And she said, "Okay, that's a wonderful profession, and I definitely support it. But here's the deal: you're going to go to college, and you're going to finish college, and then if you still want to be a firefighter after you graduate college, then then you can have that career trajectory." So I said, "Okay, deal, we'll do that." So off to college I went, and then she couldn't keep me out of college after that. After my first 4 years, it just was kind of a natural fit for me. Although I'll say I struggled my first couple years in college getting acclimated to it. But I feel like once I found kind of my niche and what I loved and my groove, it was really where I wanted to be in an academic environment and a learning environment. And so decided to apply to graduate school, and decided that I was going to do not one, but I ended up doing two master's degrees because, what are you going to do with two master's degrees, right? Again, I was just one of those people that was a career student. I loved learning for the sake of learning. And then from there, I actually had an advisor that I was working with on a project, or I don't remember exactly what I was doing with her, but we were talking about writing, the love of writing that I had. And she said, this kind of love for writing and this kind of love of learning is what really makes people good at PhD programs. You might want to consider that. And I hadn't really ever considered it before then until she planted that seed. And so I'm incredibly grateful that she said that day, because I remember that conversation clear as day. And that's when I actually started to think to myself, you know what? Maybe I could do this. Maybe I could apply for a PhD program and see where it takes me. So.
You mentioned it took you a couple of years to get acclimatized. What would you tell freshman Kellie or any other young person listening how to navigate that first couple of years of higher education to make sure that you are on a track that actually genuinely interests you?
Probably spend less time in the unofficial extracurricular activities of college and more time in the classroom and in your books and in your studies. That was probably advice I would have given myself, but probably wouldn't have taken at that point in my life. um, but yeah, I think, just the opportunity to really immerse yourself into college life and into, all of the different opportunities that being in a university or an academic environment can avail you. I think that I might have limited myself with some of those opportunities. So, just being willing and open-minded to seek out experiences that you might be unfamiliar with.
And what area were you actually focusing on as far as academics?
So I was really unsure. I really was unsure up until like my senior year, when I had to choose something. So I was undecided, and I just did a lot of the general education requirements, and thought that I might want to go into teaching. So kind of went down that path, and my bachelor's degree is actually from the College of Education, but it's a recreation and sports related degree. So, was just really undecided for a long time. And my final semester, you had to do an internship, and I I was doing a work study assignment and ended up doing my internship at the same location. It was a nonprofit charitable organization called Big Brothers Big Sisters. They do mentorship initiatives with higher risk youth in the community, and just ended up loving that. And again, had a great mentor there. And she had a master's degree in social work and a master's degree in public administration. And again, really sparked that interest in me. Like, let me learn a little bit more about this and see if this is something I might want to do.
One of my good friends did the Big Brother program, and it was so rewarding for both of them. He was a firefighter out in California when I was at the time, and then this young lad. I don't think he came from like a catastrophic home, but he certainly didn't have that male figure, kind of like your uncles with you. And yeah, I remember just him talking about just simply just spending time with this little boy, and he ended up having a child of his own. And I'm sure even as a parent, as a young man, being part of that mentorship program helped him develop the parenting skills for his own son.
Yeah, absolutely. And the ironic thing is so there were a couple of different firefighters. I'm sure there were more than a couple, but just a couple that I knew who were big brothers and big sisters with that same organization in Tallahassee that I was an intern with, who had just come into being a big brother or a big sister, that 20 years down the road now into this work, I have reconnected with, that I had known from that mentorship program, who are, retiring out of the fire service now, and they were just coming into the fire service back in those days. So that's a neat connection.
Absolutely. Well, same kind of human. I think, the people that step up to be first responders would probably be good mentors, as long as the job, and we'll get into this, aspects of the job don't, interfere along the way. So what about from the research point of view? Where did you find yourself kind of narrowing your focus?
Sure. Again, just looking at the impact of lifestyle choices on our health and wellness, both mental health and physical health. When I was in the social work program, I ended up getting a clinical MSW. So when you go to get a master of social work degree, typically you can go on one of two different tracks. You can get a policy related degree, or you can get a clinical related degree. And the clinical related degree is what sets you up to then go on and get a license and to be able to see clients and do those sorts of things. And I knew I was really interested in policy work as well, which is one of the reasons that I decided to also do the MPA in addition, because I really wanted to do the clinical social work side, the mental health side. And it's kind of interesting because at that point, I didn't really think I wanted to do mental health work. I knew the value of it and the importance of it, but I just didn't think it was where I would end up in my career. So it's one of those things where you never know where life is going to end up taking you. And when I got into my PhD, I really started looking at things from the public health perspective, and spent a lot of time and a lot of years doing work in different aspects of public health. I wrote a public health related dissertation, which led me to taking my first faculty position, was actually at UWF over in West Florida in Pensacola. Doing some more public health related work there. And then I took a job in a tobacco program. So tobacco and cancer prevention, looking more on the public health kind of side of things. And then ended up taking a faculty position at Florida A&am University, which is where I was most recently before I transitioned here to UCF. In their public health program, and started doing this work with first responders, and kind of led me back to that mental health range. So I would say, if I were to pick like a broad bucket to put all of the different research that I've focused on in, it is from that public health lens, or that public health perspective, just the different elements of it.
I put a post up the other day, and it was a picture from, it's either the 80s or the 90s, and it was a bunch of people from the tobacco companies swearing in a court of law that their products were not addictive. And I was kind of curious, so I researched, and I think if I've got this right, it was 4 million people die every year from tobacco products. around the world. So the tobacco related diseases. So when you looked, obviously you're looking now at the US lens, though. What was the impact? Because it's something that's kind of been downgraded. Obviously, luckily, a lot less people smoke now, but there are still companies that make money from products that we know, hands down, kill probably hundreds of thousands in this country alone. So, talk to me. I'm obviously getting facts from outside. You're inside. What is the impact of tobacco on the health of America in 2025?
Yeah, it's still tremendous. It certainly is significantly reduced since those years that you kind of talked about in the days of old. But that under the tobacco settlement agreements in the 90s, the tobacco companies were actually held financially liable for that incidence and prevalence of burden that their product was inflicting upon the American public. And so they had to pay a lot of money in the tobacco settlements nationwide. And Florida in particular was a huge beneficiary of a lot of that tobacco funding, which has gone over the last 20, 25 years to produce a lot of prevention and cessation programs to help people who are smokers stop using products, because it's very hard to stop once you start. It's purposefully addictive. And to prevent, again, the replacement smokers is what the tobacco companies would actually call them in a lot of the court documents that were uncovered. But these replacement smokers that they would have to find because their other smokers were dying, so they would have to find a replacement for their market, for their customers. So Florida's done an amazing job with their tobacco program in particular. It's one of the national kind of best practice models out there, and how states can go about preventing and helping people quit using tobacco products. So the landscape looks a lot better. They're still very damaging, and a lot of damaging being done. And there's a lot of subpopulations of smokers, different professions and things like that, different areas. Rural areas still have higher tobacco use rates. Actually, if you have a mental health issue or if you're in a lower socioeconomic status, you're more likely to still use these products. So there's a disparate burden of the disease in certain populations. But the industry is very savvy, so they're coming up with new products now to target, the vapes and the oral products, not necessarily like the chew, but which is still a big problem, but other little the packets that you can use. So there's a lot of different products out there on the market now that can be just as damaging to your old fashioned combustible cigarette.
Well, I saw they just announced a study where they prove that, yeah, you can get popcorn lung from vapes. And it makes perfect. This is the thing. My whole lens on everything is just common sense. And when you understand that there are oils in these inhalation products, lungs and oils don't go together. We know even like the drugs that we used to put down the airway for cardiac arrests, we stopped doing that because they were detrimental. But for young people to be inhaling oils, and you've seen, like, it's not like a cigarette where you light it, it has, whatever, a 2-minute lifespan, and then you've got to put it away. People walk around sucking on these things all day. So I would imagine they're probably inhaling even more than the average cigarette in some areas.
Yeah, absolutely. And like you're saying too, there's not a lot of research on some of the impacts. So we just don't know. And is it worth that risk of, kind of being the lab rat for a new product that's come out that we just don't know how it might impact you. We suspect it's not going to be good, but I don't know if I want to take that risk.
What about, you mentioned the addictive qualities? We hear this, but it would be interesting, with the lens that you have, diving deep into the research. Talk to me about the development of the things in the cigarette to make it even more addictive than just regular leaf tobacco.
Yeah, so the leaf tobacco's in there, and that has addictive properties, but there's just tons of additives that are added in there on top of that are also addictive. And some of the science would show that some of those additives that are in there are even worse for you than the the tobacco itself that's in there. The nicotine's bad for you, but some of these other chemical additives are even more highly addictive and worse for you. But, you know, it's physiologically, it changes your physiology, right? It has changes in the brain. It has changes in your body and your cardiovascular system. And there's these properties that happen in your brain and body when you ingest the products that contribute to the addictive qualities of it. And, I don't oftentimes wonder if that's why they find people who are struggling with substance use. There's poly substance use going on. So people who are using alcohol heavily are also more likely to be using tobacco products, or people with depression are more likely to be using tobacco products because it's a coping mechanism, and it's an easy, almost immediate way to inflict changes in your brain chemistry and changes in your heart rate and other physiological things going on within your body to maybe get some relief from some of those anxiety symptoms or depression symptoms, whatever you might be encountering.
Absolutely. Well, one more area and then we'll move away from tobacco. But this is something that I've been pondering since I heard a guest on Joe Rogan's show, probably, God, well over a year ago now. But they were talking, I think, about big pharma. And this guy was a guru, Sid Guru, I think his name was. And Joe, was rightly, like we all would do, talking about the CEOs of, Purdue Pharma or someone saying, well, they're shitbags. And he goes, no, they're suffering too. And I'd never thought about that. And all of a sudden, it reframes everything from presidents to CEOs of companies to fire chiefs and union leaders that refuse to act when their people are being buried. With the tobacco company and with you having this interesting mental health lens at the same time, what is your perspective of the mental health of someone who creates a product that kills arguably millions of people around the globe and can still sleep at night? Because my opinion of that is, we talk about mental health in the fire service, for example, they're talking about me, the firefighter, the engineer, the captain. But we forget that also applies to the city and county council members and the fire chief. And if, to me, if you are unfazed by people dying through your lack of actions or your product, I personally would say, well, there's obviously a kind of borderline sociopathy element to your mental health as well.
Yeah, so there certainly would appear to be an ability to disconnect from the suffering of those individuals that you might have a role in on behalf of those, and whether it be for profit. I mean, that's a big part of it, right? I mean, it is extremely profitable. I'm not sure. So that's actually a really good question. And I'm not sure if that's been studied, looking at like the personality characteristics of individuals who engage in those types of behaviors. I mean, certainly, obviously there's a lot of literature and research out there on sociopathical behavior and kind of the characteristics and the personality profile of those individuals. But, kind of looking at other industries, like big industries, and the leadership of those industries and what types of characteristics they might display that could be similar. I don't know that there's ever been any large studies done on that, but it certainly would be interesting. But just, from my perspective and how I'm thinking about it, there certainly must be an inherent ability to kind of step back and distance yourself from that. And I remember something that was really striking. I know we're trying to get away from tobacco, but just
no,
please for a second. When I was reading through some of the court files that they made public after the big tobacco settlements, they would ask the tobacco industry CEOs if they use the products themselves, or if they would ever have a family member or a person they love use the products themselves. And many of them would say no. So I felt that was very telling in and of itself, that they would never use these products themselves.
Yeah, exactly. Like the social dilemma, even though a lot of the people on there were trying to bring light to the issue with social media, the number of people that were creators that realized, oh my God, I can't even stop using it. So they literally banned their
Mhm.
children from using the very app that
Right.
they developed.
Right. Yeah, I had forgotten about that. That was a good watch. My son was relatively young when that came out, and I was trying to get him to watch it, but I think he was just too young at the time to get it because he was like just right there getting into, wanting to be on social media.
Absolutely. Well, let's kind of walk through the introduction of the fire service. So you mentioned you met Brandon when he was in the academy, which is a really interesting lens to begin that relationship. So walk me through, before we even get to research and firefighter health, like the perspective of being a firefighter spouse, and the children being, firefighter children in this world as he progressed through his career.
So I think that I was aware that it was challenging or that it was difficult. I remember, especially in fire school, the long days, the physical demand, the mental demand of the training, but I also saw how passionate he was about it and how much he loved it. And he ended up going to an EMT program that was out of state. So he was gone for the duration of the time that he was in the EMT program. So there was that really long period of separation there. So I think some of those things kind of set us up for having a better sense of what, when he finally got out and was on the job, what it might be like with shift work and separation and time off and physical demands and mental demands. But just to be completely honest with you, I don't think that I truly realized, and I won't say understand because I never think you can really truly understand somebody else's experience. You can recognize it and hear their story, but I don't know if you can ever truly walk a day in their shoes and understand something that they've gone through. But I didn't get it. I didn't even start to get it, even as coming from a fire service family myself and being a fire service spouse. I just didn't get it until I started doing this work. And a perfect example of this is he was early on in his career. He was working for Escambia County over in Pensacola, and I was at UWF. And we had to do an event the day that he got off shift, and he came home. And I was getting ready for this event and he was running late, so I was frustrated because we needed to get ready and we needed to go to this event. And he got home, and the reason that he was late was because he had just worked a 4-child fatality fire that night. And he was telling me about it, and I was like, okay, well, let's go. We got this other stuff to do. Let's get ready. We got to go. And I think back on that now, and I just, I see how much I missed in that moment. Looking back on it now, I could see his affect was different. I could see his body language was different. Just everything was different. And he's telling me about what he's just been through. And, I didn't even take the time to stop and think, wow. It was just like, oh, it's part of the job. They see this all the time. It's not going to impact him. He left work at work, and we're going to go on with our lives and with our day. And so that was a really big learning experience for me. But it took me, a couple years looking back to realize that I had done that. So I always try to share that story with other spouses, who may not have a sense of how impactful some of these things can be and how they might need just a little bit of extra time to decompress. And while that doesn't mean they can, totally shirk household responsibilities and use it as a reason to get out of parenting, or get out of whatever, but it just that balance in the household of respecting each other's needs and being able to verbalize each other's needs and what it is that you're going through in that moment, and having the other person truly listen to you and hear you.
What about, as the years go on, the chronic impact? Because when we first get hired, and I've reflected on this a lot recently, when I got hired by Hialeah, the demand was so high in 2004, they didn't even tell us what our salary was. So about 3 weeks into it, that's how desperate we were to get hired. And, it was, again, competing against hundreds, if not thousands of people, depending on the department. And so you're not thinking about the other stuff. You're told, 1 on 2 off and all these things, and it's great. And when someone tells you at the front door it's great and you're chomping at the bit to do this profession, you just take it, you accept it. This is what it is. But over time, a lot of people kind of start to have this aha moment, especially if it's the family of, where they're like, wait a second, these things don't line up. You're supposed to have all this time, you're supposed to have all this, to recovery, and yet you just seem exhausted. So what did you, with this again, this health lens that you have, what was the kind of observations that you made as he progressed through his career?
I think, you kind of get out of that honeymoon period pretty early on. You still, and my husband, he's still really fired up to do the job. He loves the job. He's one of these firefighters that goes to all the outside conferences and trainings and, seeks out the big name instructors. And so he just loves the fire service and he loves what he does. But I think, again, now into our mid to late 40s, also is seeing the impacts that it can have on you physically. It's a tough job to do all these years and mentally. But I think that, early on, you definitely kind of notice that, that there's some challenges and some disadvantages, and it doesn't necessarily mean that you need to, make a change, a career change. It's just like, how are you going to step up to that? How are you going to learn to adapt to that? How are you going to learn to approach that situation and handle that situation and respond to it to really get the outcomes that you're desiring? And so, instead of kind of shying away from those challenges, which is sometimes the easier thing to do. And sometimes you're just exhausted and you're like, you know what, I don't want any challenges today. I'm not up for learning a new strategy to, address my stress today. I just would like for things to be easy. But I again, I have an 18-year-old son, and that's a lot of what we've been talking about with him lately is, life isn't so much about being able to avoid all the tough or challenging moments. The real power comes from knowing that, okay, I might not be able to avoid this happening in my life, but I can make choices about how I'm going to be able to react to it. And I can learn how to manage my emotions and manage my stress and use skills and techniques to be able to respond to how I react to these things as opposed to just, trying to avoid them.
Yeah, I think as well, adding that same lens is also something that I think the younger generation are starting to do really well, which is also question, well, why are we doing it this way? And we'll obviously get into work weeks and stuff, but that's, again, we just blindly went in. And I'll ask you, I've got a kind of research-based question I'll put to you in a minute. Putting that aside for a moment, though, at what point did the fire service and your research background start to intersect?
So that was probably formally, I would say, about 6-7 years ago. One of the chiefs came up to us and said, "Hey, do you guys know anything about this whole PTSD thing?" And we said, "Well, we know a lot about
itself. The fact that he
right?
just phrased it that way, that speaks volumes.
That was really kind of exactly how he said it. Like, what is this? What is this thing? And like, do we need to be worried about it? And at the time, at least in the work that I had done in my background, we knew quite a bit about PTSD, but not really so much about PTSD in the fire service. And this is really only like 6 or 7 years ago. So not even that long ago. I still kind of feel like we were just starting to shed some light on this. And there's been a lot of work done, in the last, I would say 10 years, in the last 5 or 6 years in particular. But being the good, academicians that we were like, well, we don't know a lot. So what are we going to do? Well, we're going to do some research. We're going to research this. So we started doing research, and it was nice because we had fairly easy access to the population, which a lot of researchers actually struggle with, building rapport and building trust with first responder populations to be able to get access to do research. Because first responders aren't lining up to participate in your survey all the time. So to be able to get access to the population was huge, and to use the contacts and the connections to do that was huge. But what we started learning was, really troubling. We were looking at things like substance use, depression, anxiety, suicidal thoughts, and we were just finding that the prevalence of them was so much higher among, and we started with the fire service, but then it started including law enforcement, dispatch, EMS. But the prevalence of these things was really just very concerning. And even more concerning was that there weren't resources out there. There, wasn't like, okay, this person is, this firefighter is having suicidal thoughts. Well, what do we do with him or her? Well, we don't know. We don't. Isn't there like a mental hospital or something for that? I mean, there weren't a lot of resources and options, particularly in the area of Florida that we were in at the time. Lots of rurality and just provider shortages, things like that. So I, got really tired and frustrated of rolling into rooms full of white shirts and saying, hey, 30% of your firefighters are indicating that they would have provisional PTSD on the screener, or 40% are experiencing symptoms of depression, and and then I wouldn't have anything to follow that up and say, but hey, here's what we can do to help the situation. So I was like, all right, next time I'm going into one of those meetings, I'm going to be ready to go. We're going to have some programs and services. And so I sought out some grant funding and was incredibly grateful to get our first federal SAMHSA grant to start doing some of this work. And that was where Second Alarm Project was born. I wrote that grant in the midst of having the flu. I had the flu, and I was like, this grant's just too important to not write it and get it at this point. So I wrote that grant with the flu, and Brandon, my husband, and actually one of our really good friends who's a deputy, he's a law enforcement officer, came up with the name for it. We were trying to come up with a name, and then we were having in a group text like, hey, what would be a good name for this program, this organization? And our deputy friend, he said, what's that thing you guys call it when you don't have enough resources at a fire and you have to call more people in? And Brandon replied, you have to call in a second alarm. And I was like, that's it. That's the name.
Beautiful. What was the landscape of research? I mean, we'll get into the resources and culturally competent clinicians in a moment, but when it comes to the entire mental health conversation, but especially like identifying each of these pillars that is breaking down mental health in our profession.
So I think, mental health overall doesn't have parity with regard to physical health in the research world. There is a lot of research that's done, but if you look at, mental health conditions, particularly things that I think really impact the fire service, like, substance use and depression, they just don't have the type of dollars that have been allocated to physical health. And so and that's just mental health in general. But then when you look at the research that's being done with the first responder population, it's even more challenging because there isn't a lot of funding, for one thing. As I mentioned, they're a very hard population to be able to get to participate in research. People just overall don't like talking about mental health. That's why I'm just excited to continue normalizing these conversations and help spread the message that your mental health and your physical health really should be looked at as one, that whole brain body connection thing that we could probably talk about forever. But it is just as important, if not more important than keeping your body physically fit. You got to keep your brain in check and in balance to be able to do your work and to do your job. So there's just not a lot of great research out there, and we hope to continue to contribute to that. We've got a few studies going on, different pockets of things here and there that we're looking at overall, but ultimately I would love to see some type of epidemiological longer term data set of data collected for mental health conditions in the fire service so we can kind of track it over time, and then really look at some of these initiatives and say, hey, this is working, or we're spending a lot of money on this but we're not really seeing a good ROI, those types of things.
What about the shift work side? We're going to get in obviously to the study that you're part of now, but as you are diving in, because when I hear the mental health conversation, it's nearly always, oh, it's what these people see. It's like, yeah, that's one tiny sliver of the pie chart, but when are we going to talk about the rest, from unaddressed childhood trauma to sleep deprivation and everything in between? But even Sarah Jenke admitted that when we did our first interview, which is about 5 years ago now, she almost kind of guffawed when I mentioned sleep deprivation. And she said it in the next interview. I got to be completely honest. When I started looking into it, I was like, oh my God, this is. Now, this is what's really surprising to me is, we talk about culturally competent clinicians. Well, I had an aha moment today of like, well, we also need culturally competent researchers.
Mm-hmm.
Because if your only research is going to be, well, let me look at a different 56-hour work week, that's not exactly cutting edge science. That's, fixing nothing really. So, what was the discussion when you first dove in, and then what is the metamorphosis now of putting this extremely important element into this mental health equation?
Yeah, absolutely. And Sarah Jenke, she's kind of one of my role models and mentors. And when I first started doing this work, and I had two goals when I first started doing this work. The first one is I wanted to know absolutely everything I could about what does the science say about this work with first responders, like the good science. So I dove in, and of course, that's where I found Dr. Jenke's work, and reached out to her really early on, send an email. Hi, Dr. Jenke. I want to do this research and I would love to connect with you to learn more. And thought I had like a probably like maybe a 5% chance of ever hearing back from her, because a lot of times I had done this over the course of my career. You reach out to these researchers who are doing amazing things, and a lot of them don't get back to you. Well, she actually got back to me right away, which was amazing. And so now to consider her a colleague of mine is a huge honor for me to be able to do that. She's incredible. And now that I'm talking about her, I've completely totally forgot your question. Oh, the landscape of the research. And so I also wanted to know who was already doing this work and who was doing it well. And that kind of led me to a lot of the other partnerships that we've got going on right now. But when I started this, it was very much like, it's the trauma, it's the trauma, it's the trauma. And I think that's an important part of it, definitely. But I think that is so intertangled with everything else that you've been talking about, that we're trying to kind of pull out and tease apart. And that's what good research does. It says, okay, well, how much weight can we give to each of these elements that are going on here? And where can we get the most impact? If we start to kind of change this one variable, do we see bigger changes in the other variables? And if we can find that one thing that we can really work with and change for the most amount of people, then let's put our efforts there. Let's put our efforts into that. And so I think it's pretty cool, some of the initiatives that we're working on, kind of moving from, let's wait until this trauma happens and then find out which therapeutic approaches can help to repair the damage inflicted by the trauma, which again, that's still really important. We've got to be doing that because, like you mentioned, all of this stuff that all of us bring in from childhood is still going to be there anyway, and potentially need to be addressed as well. But just looking at some of the other elements that we can tap into to better prepare the first responders' bodies and brains to be able to manage all of this is where I'm really excited to see the research going.
I had a gentleman on the show. He's actually coming back on, Professor Russell Foster. And it's funny because no one recognizes his name, even, some of the sleep researchers, but he is the man and his team who discovered the chronoreceptor, so the photoreceptor in the eye. So before that, the ophthalmology world would laugh at him and say, there's only rods and cones in the retina, that's it. And he was able to prove it. And that to me is cutting edge science. And I don't understand why the research world, especially, for example, in the Harvard, for example, is in the Boston area. They work a 42-hour work week. A lot of the Northeast does. Washington, D.C., 42-hour work week. I don't understand why there's still this myopic thing of like, okay, well, we'll study the 4896 or the 1323. That's all the studies that have been out here so far. And obviously we're going to talk about the 2472. But wouldn't it be amazing to go, okay, we're going to study baseline for recruits in the academy for both of these departments. We've got a 2472 one and we've got a 2448 one. And then we're going to study the 10-year guys and the 20-year guys just to get an overview. And of course, we know exactly what you're going to find. The people with more rest and recovery are ultimately going to be healthier. But I don't understand. I'd love you to kind of educate me why there's a massive deviation in the research world for studying what I call the herd of elephants in the room, which is why the fuck are first responders working 56 hours a week in the first place?
Yeah, absolutely. I think honestly that you hit the nail on the head. It's that occupational competency. Like, you just don't know what you don't know. And if you're a researcher going in and you want to study this phenomenon and you don't know some of the nuances that are going on that you might want to include, exclude, whatever from your study, you miss something. You can miss a lot by not having that real intimate knowledge of the population that you're working with, which is why I think it's so important for members of the fire service to be involved in, the front end of this work, to say, hey, we need to be considering these things. This is really what we need to be looking at. Hey, have you thought about looking at it this way? Because you just don't know. Like, I mean, you can be as culturally competent as you can, but if you've never actually done the job yourself, you don't have that perspective.
Yeah. And I think what's dangerous, and again, this is not blaming the researchers. I underline, like with Joel, for example, it sounds like I'm kind of beating him down when I talk about this. But when he did his study and it was on a department that ran less than one call a night, now you have urban and suburban departments going, the 4896 is the healthier one. Science proved it. Well, as we mentioned, there were studies by tobacco companies that said that cigarettes were fine. You got to understand the study and the sample size and the type of department. And even then, you still got to ask the question, yeah, but why do they need to be away from their family for 56 hours? So this is what's exciting now. And again, it's not by any mean, having any sort of negative view of the researcher, but it's confirmation bias. Well, go ahead and study 56 versus 56. Oh, 56? Okay, brilliant. Then I don't have to do anything as a chief. We'll just carry on and we'll move some days around. Versus we have this massive problem. It's like that DARPA. DARPA is the research organization that says, all right, robots in space, all right, go prove it can't work. And then they come out with these incredible things. That's how, GPS and AI and all these other things were developed. Well, it's not even requiring that kind of bandwidth. But we as a profession need to be honest with you as a research community and say, look, if we're really being honest, one of the biggest problems is this. Is this an area that you want to go look in? And then you start providing data, and the cortisol is this and the HRV is that. And we see this fewer, cancers and this fewer mental health issues, and more relationships are intact. And now people will go, okay, now we start seeing it. But it's our fault. I've always said this. This is our fault as a profession because we have lied to everyone about what we do.
My dog is in complete agreement with you there, enthusiastically.
So like the 1 on 2 off and all these things that we talk about, it's not 1 day on, 2 days off. It's 3 days crammed together with 1 day off, as if you equate it 24/48. So how can we expect to have good research when we're not even telling the researchers what we do? And then, like you said, when they come to the station, Murphy's Law, they might want to experience something, and then we have a quiet day so they get a skew perspective too. So it's merging these two. And obviously the study that you guys are embarking on is going to help. But now these departments are making this switch. Now we can actually start getting data of the biggest element that everyone was missing, whether it was a cancer conversation, the mental health conversation, the weight gain, the testosterone, the mental health, the addiction, all these things that we know are directly correlated, not solely, but directly correlated with sleep deprivation, and actually start talking about it.
Yeah, one of the things that I love, one of the sayings that I love is that good science generates even better science. So you're always going to have limitations, but as researchers, we try our best to minimize the limitations, to minimize the bias that you bring in to the equation. But I think that it's just incredibly important that we continue to push the envelope and to generate this science and to get larger sample sizes, right? Because again, in the research world, that's really what people hang their hat on, and that's really what you're looking for is, something that you can say is generalizable. And that in the research world, right, that's the gold standard, is you want something that's large enough, a study that's large enough and that has enough statistical power to say that it's generalizable. You can say that from this limited set of individuals that we looked at in the study, we can say that we have a high level of confidence that the vast majority of others are going to be similar to them in some way. And that takes time. And sometimes you have to make decisions, and their life or death decisions is what we're talking about, is people's lives here. And you don't have time to get that level of confidence in your data. But I think that we still can do a good service in pushing that forward and doing that and getting more studies and larger sample sizes. That way we can generalize. And that's one of the challenges that we have. Like when we were talking about our study that we're currently looking at with the D shift, is that we just have such a small sample size because it's the research on it is in its infancy. But I think it's a balancing act between, waiting for the research to come out and deciding what you might need to do as far as policy and changes to your department and your organization in the meantime.
Yeah, and I've said this. I mean, there's a certain line, obviously, where common sense just comes into it. And, when it comes to is 56 hours a week more detrimental than 42, firstly, it's common sense. It's like, do I really need to do research on if I stand in front of a moving bus, I'm going to get run over? There's a certain, where's that line of common sense? But also you can flip it around. People say to me, well, show me the data. I'm like, well, as we just discussed, there isn't any data on the 2472. And I would ask why. IAFF, everyone else involved, chiefs organizations, why isn't there? Because there sure as hell should have been now. But let's flip it around. We've got amazing data on what doesn't work. The graveyards are full of firefighters. So do you really need to wait for a study that shows that maybe if we give them more rest and recovery and therefore attract young people and fill these vacancies in these departments, stop the mandatory overtime, that's going to be beneficial? No, of course we don't. But is it good along the way to start studying it now and backing it up with data and actually using that research to amplify things? 100%. But what I see a lot of times is, we need to see the data is a deliberate hurdle because someone doesn't want to actually do their job. Sure. And those two things are two separate conversations.
Sure, absolutely. It can definitely be used to stonewall.
Yeah. All right. Well, I want to get to Second Alarm and UCF Restores and all the solutions for people that are, on this journey already. But just while we're on the proactive side, talk to me about what you're doing with FSU now, which departments you study, and then kind of what are the variables that you're looking at, baseline and beyond.
Yes. So very exciting to be involved in this project. I met Kyle Smith out of FSU a year or so ago. So it's relatively new partnership, new relationship in this work that we're doing. He and one of his other colleagues were doing a different study on firefighters in a supplement. Didn't have anything to do with shift work. It was looking at different supplementation to help firefighters' performance and recovery. And my husband actually ended up being a participant in that study. he was really excited about it because my husband and I, as we met at CrossFit. I didn't mention that. I probably should have mentioned that. So that was where we ended up meeting. But we both have always been really interested in recovery and heart rate variability and sleep and how can we improve it personally in our own lives. So we've always worn a Whoop band ever since Whoop band came out. And he was super excited about this study because he's like, yeah, I get a whole year's subscription to Whoop Band if I participate in this study. So I want to help the research, but I also want to get a whole free year's worth of subscription to the Whoop Band. So I'm in this study, and I was like, oh, that's interesting. What are they looking at? And I wanted to learn a little bit more about the study. So he told me, and he was talking with, I don't know if he was talking with Lily, Kyle's colleague, or if he was talking with Kyle, but they were talking about some of these other studies that they were planning with the fire service. And they started talking about mental health. And my husband said, oh, you should probably connect with my wife on this. This is like what she does too in the mental health. And so that was how I connected with the researchers from FSU and learned that they were going to start looking at Gainesville's transition from, I believe they were on 24 48s into the D shift. And so I connected with Kyle. And I said, hey, are you looking at any psychological measures along with what it is that you're looking at? And he said, no, we didn't have anybody to do that. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is like perfect timing. I would love to be involved if I can. And he was very welcoming. And so it was a nice pairing of their area of expertise being able to look at the physiological implications of this potential shift change, or the potential physiological implications of the shift change through monitoring with the Whoop band and saliva sampling with us on the psychological side, where we're doing some assessments of work-life balance and resilience and quality of life, those types of things. So we first cohort coming through was Gainesville. And then the second cohort we've got involved now is Destin Fire Rescue. And then we're pretty excited. We're actually working on another study with Pasco County. Pasco County is doing some really, really cool and innovative stuff with their new hires. We're working on a study with them, but they're going to come on board as our next cohort. So what's exciting about that is Gainesville and Destin are both very small organizations, but Pasco is a large-ish organization. So we will hopefully potentially have a lot more members who are able and willing to participate to gather some data from.
I'm going to get Dixon back on the show, because when he started telling me, we were talking a few weeks ago, about all the other stuff they do at Pasco, all the other proactive, that they've got health resources and obviously mental health resource. And there's such a low, if not zero, barrier to entry that, the last time we talked about the 2472, now we're going to get to unpack all the other things. Extremely, extremely proactive department. And it's so exciting because now I'm sure they were probably losing recruits to other people, and now they're going to be circling around. And once they see they've got a healthy work week and all these other tools really supporting their firefighters, I got a funny feeling they're going to be retaining a lot of their people now.
Yeah, I think so. We were actually out there earlier this week doing the kickoff for the study that we're doing with them. And they had a packed house full of new recruits. We walked into the room and we were like, whoa, we weren't expecting this many of you. So that was fantastic. And just their willingness to be open-minded about implementing, for example, what we're doing with Pasco now is we're looking at a breath work intervention and gratitude journaling. And so, both have some foundational science behind the positive benefits, both physiologically and psychologically. But I feel like if you would try to walk into a lot of other fire departments and say, hey, we want to get your members to do some breathing exercises and gratitude journaling, you'd be laughed right out of there at best. That would be probably the most pleasant thing they would say. So just their willingness to entertain some of these ideas has been awesome.
I got a friend who came on who's a, oh my goodness, where was he? Tampa cop. That's right. So close to Pasco. One of his friends works in Pasco on the kind of the hiring side now for fire rescue. And he said, I literally need to hire another person I said the phone will not stop ringing from people wanting to work for Pasco. Now they heard about the 2472. And this is what I'm telling people. And now there's a revolution. So now it's not just a hypothesis, we're seeing it. But when you show these young people that you actually care enough and you want them to be home and you want your department fully staffed so you're not being forced to work over and over again, build it, they will come. And Pasco has seen it, and Boca has seen it, and Gainesville has seen it, and Destin has seen it. So, it's so great to hear because, again, it is common sense, but now you can actually point and say, go ask them. Like you said, ask Kelly how full that room was when she walked in. Had that been, Marion County where I live, very, very different, scrambling just to find anyone to fill the seats. And I don't mean that judgmentally. I just mean it's pure numbers. Before you used to be able to take 10% of the list. Now, a lot of these departments are taking 60, 70, 80% of the list. So it is a very different landscape. But seeing that people have done it, large county, small county, rich county, not so affluent city, whatever it is, like they all made it work because they simply said, enough is enough. We're going to just, draw a line in the sand and make it happen. And now we have these shining examples of all the things that we talked about. So it's really exciting that you've managed to capture some baselines and then, get the other side. Because I know even with Gainesville, I think their firefighters are fully staffed, and they did that between September and April, which is amazing. But at the officer level, because it's a young department, I think they're still considering laterals or, they've got some places to fill. So that would be a kind of skewed perspective until they're truly on a 2472 all the way through the ranks.
Yeah, I think that that's such an important point you make too. Again, going back to the nuances of the research, if your researchers don't know things like that about what's going on, that might be reflected in the data, you could come up with some potentially really skewed findings that aren't accurate. That your findings might not really be reflective of what it's going to look like in the future because of something exactly like that happening.
Absolutely. So that's proactivity. Now let's talk about, this is proactive as well, but let's talk about the resources. You mentioned when you first kind of explored this area, it was hard to find a mental health practitioner that was really culturally competent, that knew how to work with us. So you get this grant money. What were the tools that you started building for our community and the first responder professions through the Second Alarm Project?
So we originally started with these 4 areas or 4 pillars of the program that we wanted to be able to offer. And we wanted to be able to offer them in a way that was, again, competent for the population and very first responder specific. And so peer support is an evidence-based intervention in mental health, and it's not a new thing. It's been around for 150 years. Mental health has been doing peer support, and it's now been brought into the first responder realm in the last, 20 years or so, and definitely in the last 10 years. And so there's a lot of good hard science that shows the benefits of peer support and the benefits of peer support with first responders. So we definitely knew we needed to grow the availability of peer support within the community. So that was a big part of what we did. We also wanted to make sure that there was opportunities for culture change and leadership involvement in these initiatives, and really like driving the culture change in the organization was one of the biggest parts. So being able to educate leadership on why mental wellness was important and why you need to have these resources available for your people and why it makes a difference. And that's, becoming a much easier sell for sure these days, but it's still in some places, it's a really hard sell. There's just, there's a lot of very old school thinking out there, or just people who haven't had access to this information their whole lives. So they're unaware of it. We also wanted to make sure that we did have a level of access to clinicians, and not for individuals to not have to go through their EAP or to not have to even go through their commercial insurance carrier, because we were finding this phenomenon of, I don't know if you've heard of it, of ghost networks. It's where you have what's supposedly good insurance coverage, which many first responders do, right? If you work for a city or county municipality, they typically have a healthy insurance plan that you can participate in. But we were finding that these mental health networks were largely ghost networks, meaning that it looks like there's 100 providers on this list. But when you start calling down, you can't get in touch with 75% of them. The number isn't active anymore, or you get a voicemail recording that says, don't leave a message because your message will not be returned on this line. We're not taking new patients. So we have one of our larger agencies in the area, the peer support team, called down their network list. And I think out of 120 providers on the list, they were actually able to make contact with 4 or 5 of them. And I don't think any of them had expertise in working with first responders. So, again, we were trying to avoid as many impediments to accessing services as possible. So we wanted to make sure we had a carve out to be able to connect a first responder with a clinician right away, immediately, to set up services. We also wanted to make sure what we were doing was again rooted in science to be able to evaluate it. So that was kind of the skeleton of the program as it started, to offer education opportunities on different topics, which we've carried over and carried forth. But I would say our program is still largely structured very similarly. Those are our core components that we do. With the integration or the collaboration partnership now with UCF Restores, we've even expanded the ability to look at treatment in a different way. What they have been able to do with as far as success in treating PTSD has been unparalleled in any of the literature that I've seen. So being able to get that out to more first responders who may have tried everything else and they're still suffering, I think is a really big opportunity.
I want to go back to what you said. Peer support has been around for 150 years. Which profession was that in? One would make the assumption it was the military, but...
So it is historically rooted in the military, although a lot of these weren't like formal peer support. I'm trying to think of the term is escaping me. A battle buddy. There you go. The military's had battle buddies for as long as there's been the military, and just in more recovery oriented mental health services. So looking in people with severe and persistent mental health issues, for example, peer support has been used in those communities for a very long time. And it has been so important because, as we've kind of said it several times throughout this conversation, somebody else with the same lived experience as you, or a similar lived experiences as you, it just levels the playing field. You feel like you don't have to do a lot of explaining. You feel like there's less judgment. You feel like they just have this sense of understanding, or this shared connection that almost goes without words, is how we've heard it described among first responders. Someone that gets me is kind of what I like to say, that they just get me. They just understand.
That's something I heard over and over again, whether it was Struggle Well, Save a Warrior, whatever the program was, is, they would be in this group and they were like, everyone had a story. And a lot of people would say, a lot of people had it worse than me. But I think it was a real realization that everyone, when they first met each other, probably looked like they were doing okay, unless they truly were in absolute crisis, because we all have that mask. And it's so sad, because if you actually climbed inside the head of a dining room table in a firehouse, you'd realize that a lot of people were, at different levels, were going through their stuff. And as we talked about, one of I think the least discussed elements is a lot of us do have things when we were young. That doesn't mean that you're broken and you're kind of like carrying the carcass into the fire service, but there's 2 paths. If you address it, I truly believe that becomes strength. And we talked before we hit record, the hope of post-traumatic growth, I think, is what we need to be front and center now. Not, I'm living with my PTSD. That's such a doom and gloom message to everyone. But you can't, if you're not understanding that a lot of people that said, you know what, I'm going to go and risk my life for complete strangers, has probably had some shit when they were young, then we're missing a big part of the mental health puzzle. And if we can put, rather than some box checking MMPI that is not going to determine whether you can be a first responder or not, and a polygraph, which I said on here many times, I've lied myself through 3, take that money and actually put these young people through counseling at the front door, not to say, oh, you're broken, but just to say, hey, there's a good chance that the things that took you to this point now, there's going to be some struggles. Let's just have conversations. Let's just put it out there that the kind of person that you are was probably forged by some of these. And these can be absolute strengths. But if you bury it down, as that Mexican proverb says, they tried to bury us, they didn't know we were seeds. It will eventually come through. So now you've got this beautiful, healthy mental health conversation. You've removed barrier to entry to a counselor, and you've normalized this as much as PT. Now you're turning these, ultimately fractures into strengths, like the gold glue on a Japanese pottery.
Yep.
So I feel like, this is, the peer support and all these other ones, there's so many opportunities for us to just have good, proactive conversations. And even Dana Ali, who came on here a long time ago now, she was saying, I mean, if we just acted like a community again, we wouldn't even need to label it peer support anymore. We'd just be a bunch of people creating an environment that was comfortable for people to be vulnerable and therefore have no problem reaching out when they were struggling.
Yeah, absolutely. She's fantastic too, Dina. She's, again, one of those people really early on that I reached out to just because I had learned so much about the work that she had been doing, and wanted to connect with her, and she was so willing to connect and to share her knowledge. It was fantastic.
Absolutely. Well, you hit the EAP side as well, and I've never heard that ghost network, so another education for me. But I've said this a lot recently. It's so sad. I've heard so many EAP Russian roulette stories, and I've heard them because thank God that person ended up finding someone else. But I would ask people, I mean, again, we're talking about responsibility of, whether it's tobacco companies or, fire departments or cities and counties. If you are giving these resources to people who arguably could be in crisis, and they call 2 or 3 numbers and they don't get an answer, or they get told I'm a child psychologist, or they go to the person and they burst into tears when they tell them their stories and say, I can't help you. How many of those men and women are now in the ground because we failed them with that? So that's a really important point that you made, because I've heard it from so many people. I even wrote about it in my story in my latest book. That's exactly what happens to the character, because I'd heard it so many times. That's something that needs to be addressed. Everyone listening needs to go through their EAP and make these phone numbers, because some, like Pasco, I know have got an amazing list that people, are actually there on the other side. But I mean, like you said, over 104 even, answered the phone, of which none of them were truly culturally competent. Think about the deadly result of that if a firefighter or cop or dispatcher is in crisis.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a huge concern. It truly is. The Health Research Services Administration has a data set. And so they know how many licensed mental health providers there are in a particular area. And you can go on their site and look at different areas. And most of the Florida Panhandle and a lot of actually the peninsula is considered a health provider shortage area for mental health services. So we're starting, at a disadvantage there. There just really aren't enough providers in general. And depending on what area you live in really dictates if you're going to even have 100 providers to start from to begin with to call down. In some of our counties in the state, they literally have zero. They have zero licensed providers in some of these rural counties. But then finding one that doesn't just have like an occupational level of awareness about what first responders do, but then somebody that uses some evidence-based approaches to treatment for things like PTSD or suicidal thoughts. There's really only, I believe, 4 evidence-based treatments for suicidal thoughts. And that's a problem with a high level of acuity. You want to get somebody who's having suicidal thoughts to somebody who knows what they're doing with that person as soon as you can. And, when you only have a handful of evidence-based modalities out there to be able to use in that situation, and not everybody's trained in them, that reduces the likelihood that you're going to get somebody who needs the care into the care that they need. And again, that's why I've been so impressed with the treatment that is coming out of a clinical research institution like UCF Restores, because they just have a very high level of efficacy with treating PTSD into remission. And even I think this is right around 77% of first responders who come in when they leave treatment no longer have symptoms of PTSD. And that's a very high rate comparatively to the rest of the treatment population. And the incidence of relapse from it, I think, is also very low, around 1 or 2%. So just getting people to providers who are able to do these more advanced techniques and modalities is an even slimmer margin than finding a provider at all sometimes.
What are the elements that UCF Restores is doing? What are these treatments that are working so well compared to others?
So the basis or the foundation for what their therapists do is exposure-based therapies, that you might be familiar with those. Primarily something called cognitive processing therapy that's done. And it's not for everyone. So not everybody is a candidate for this type of treatment or this type of work. So there is a pretty detailed screening process that you have to go through to make sure that it's a right fit for you. But it is highly effective. And basically you have to, just in very general terms, you walk back through that traumatic event or that index trauma with that trained professional. And, as you're walking back through it, you're learning how your body reacts to the memories and the sensations of being back in that trauma. And you're learning how to cope, or some real skills. You're learning skills about how to manage the emotions and the feelings that are associated with that trauma. And so you can kind of like rewrite the way that you process that and to rewrite that narrative. So it's very intense. I've heard it described as pure hell to have to open up that can of worms and re-walk back through that. I mean, most of us who have trauma, what do you want to do? You want to box up and you never want to think about it again. You don't want to bring it right up to the forefront and work through it. But it can be a very effective means of treatment.
One of the first terms we use is PTSD, and I actually started a page years ago called the Dark Side Project. And the very first video was, I sat there and I said, my name's James Gearing and I have PTSD. I don't have PTSD. What I actually have was certainly post-traumatic stress and then moral injury. No question. At that time, I was in a toxic organizational betrayal environment, death by 1,000 cuts, but it wasn't PTSD. There wasn't an acute, I had numerous acute events, but they weren't bothering me. I wasn't having flashbacks, wasn't having nightmares, any of the things that I know are kind of indicative of that specific diagnosis. And I would argue that most of us, it's more on the moral injury side, still having an effect, anxiety, depression, addiction, whatever the side effects are. So when you don't have a specific acute event, but it's a more, like I said, the kind of Jenga effect, death by 1,000 cuts, which modalities are you seeing work well for that kind of first responder or, dispatcher, et cetera?
Yes. Yeah. So, as I mentioned, there's kind of these newer, although I'll say like something like cognitive behavioral therapy or CBT has been around for a very, very long time. It's very effective. It's very well tolerated. It's fairly easy to do. So, even if you're in an area that doesn't have a lot of clinicians with a lot of specializations, if you've got somebody that can do your garden variety CBT, you're in fairly okay hands. But they also have like specializations that they can tack on to that. There's one for suicidal thoughts. There's one for sleep disorders and sleep disruptions, which is a big deal. Finding somebody who can do those and help work with those in a first responder is important, because you can be suffering from the anxiety symptoms stemming from some type of moral injury, and it's really impacting your sleeping. And again, if you can get the biggest bang for the buck by helping that individual sleep better, it helps their brain do what it needs to do during that whole sleep process process some of that stuff. There's a modality called CAMS out there that's really helpful with suicidal ideation. There's one called DBT that's actually a pretty good modality for some of these more challenging issues that first responders might present with. So it's really just kind of a hodgepodge of different treatment modalities. And what I think would be really cool is if we could package those in a way for clinicians, and we've started to do this a little bit, but if we could package them in a way to say, hey, if you're really interested in working with this population, here's the things that they're more likely to present you with, like, the moral injury, those sorts of things. And if you want to work well with them, here's the skill set that you need to bring to the table. So I'm all for, and we're partners with the Health and Safety Collaborative on the clinician awareness training and the cultural competency. I think that's an incredibly important piece of it. But, where I think there's still a lot of room for us to do some work is, once we get these clinicians to be able to handle the nature of first responders when they come into the office, then knowing what approaches to apply with them is really a huge opportunity for us.
This is, again, learning over several years now, but what I realize is this kind of like you with CrossFit. Telling a first responder, hey, this is the thing. And I've had a couple of guests on that came on and said, this works for everyone. And the moment they said that, in my mind, I'm not rude, I was like, well, that's absolute bullshit, because nothing works for everyone. There's all these different sports and workout modalities, and it was CrossFit that you chose. But you knew that at the time, there was everything from bodybuilding to triathlons to all the things. And you went, okay, I'm going to try running. I'm not a huge fan. Okay, CrossFit. Oh, I really like this now. Oh, Olympic lifting. That's great. Oh, Orange Theory. And as you grow and as you change and as you mature, it shifts a bit. Now, understanding how large the toolbox is for a first responder, some might be very mainstream, some might be more, ayahuasca, canine therapy, whatever the things are. I think what really is empowering is to tell someone, look, you don't know exactly what's going to work for you, and that is okay. Certainly, let's head you towards the right kind of people that at least know what they're doing. Let's not make the EAP Russian roulette problem.
Right.
But once you get in there, if the EMDR doesn't work for you, okay, well, maybe you didn't have an acute event. Maybe it is that death by 1,000 cuts, and you need more of a, maybe it's a retreat like Strugglewell. Maybe it's equine therapy. I mean, all these different things. But I think, again, that message isn't out there. It's like, well, it's drugs or talk therapy, and maybe EMDR, and that's it. But that's, a tiny margin of the two extremes. And I think empowering people, even though some might still be frowned upon if you're looking at the psychedelics, it's saved a lot of lives. It just has. So whether it's there in hard facts or whether it's more observational, it's still saved a lot of lives. So I think showing the diverse spectrum of treatments that are out there and really getting someone excited, saying, look, there is hope, because I'm not telling you what to do. And if this doesn't work, you've got 50 other things to try. I think that would inspire people rather than, well, I went and spoke to a counselor, it didn't work, I'm a piece of shit, I'm out of here.
Yep, absolutely. It's a bit of an art and a science. It truly is a combination of both. And I just went and did a talk. Dina invited me to come and do a presentation at an awesome conference that they put on in Nashville here recently. And the topic that I did for that conference was the art of the match was the name of it. And it was about, matching a clinician with a first responder, and how there's, just as you were describing, there's so much that goes into it, and cultural or occupational competency is just one small piece. But the biggest takeaway that I kind of went into with this thing is that, all of us have to take a level of personal responsibility for our mental health. And just like we do with our physical health, we are, responsible for being our own self-advocate. And that's really hard to do, especially when you're struggling with something like clinical depression or some of these anxiety disorders, it's really hard, like you said, when you feel like, hey, I'm a piece of shit, I don't deserve to even go to counseling because I'm a terrible person, or some of these other crazy things that end up happening in our brains when we're struggling with things like that. But it's what I really, the message I'm trying to drive home now with this sort of accountability piece is that you might have to try more than one clinician or two clinicians. And yes, we know that many first responders are not going to do that. They're going to say, I'm going to try this once, and if it's not a good fit, then I'm not going back. I'm not going to do that. But I want to start getting the message out there that you might need to consider doing that. You might need to consider trying more than once, and you're doing yourself potentially a disservice if you're not willing to try to find that next person. But I get it. I mean, it can be incredibly defeating to be struggling with mental health and to go down a list or to see 2 providers or 5 providers, and just they're terrible. And there's some pretty terrible mental health providers out there. Unfortunately, there's way more better ones, but they're just like any profession. There's some not so good ones either. And it's just so worth it. And the benefits are so tremendous when you find that fit, and when you find that person that's going to be the one that's the right fit for you.
Absolutely. Well, I saw on your list of all the people you've got under the Second Alarm Project that there were several attached to the Struggle Well program. That's another program I've heard a lot of great things about. So why did you kind of lean towards that group? And again, talk to me about the types of outcomes or treatments that they're offering.
So, I've had the fortunate opportunity to vet a lot of different resiliency programs and organizations and take a lot of classes. And whenever I take one, I'm always kind of coming from the perspective of is this something that we would want to incorporate into what we do? And if so, how would we do it? Because we're always on the lookout for these educational and training opportunities that we might be able to scale up and get out there on a broader level. And so I just had taken, a lot of these classes, and some of them were really good, but it just wasn't anything that clicked for me as saying, wow, that's the thing. And I think it was in 2021 or 22, some of my colleagues invited me down to Coral Springs where they were having this struggle well class to come down and participate in this class. So I said, okay, this sounds great. I looked into it and looked it up, and it looked great. And so I went down and participated. And I'm telling you, I was like an hour into it, and I had drank the Kool-Aid. Man, it was fantastic. It was just, and I think for me, it was like, what hat do I have on here now that I'm sitting in this class? Is it my Second Alarm Project hat? Is it my first responder spouse hat? Or is it my Kellie O'Dare hat? And then I realized, I'm like, I've got all 3 of these hats on, and it's speaking to all 3 of these hats. Not only is this speaking to me about what I might want to bring into an element of this work that we're doing, but this is impacting me personally. These are things I want to take away and implement and practice in my own life. And so just sitting through that, I think it was a 2-day class at that time, realizing how good the material was, and it was impactful, and how it was resonating with the vast majority of the other 25 people that were in the room with me. So I reached out to them right away and just started having conversations. And I really liked that it's based on, as you mentioned, the science of post-traumatic growth, Dr. Tedeschi's work. So it had this element of being evidence-informed or evidence-based, which is really important to me as well. But I think, looking at it from the like you mentioned, the kintsugi, I think is how you say, the element of the cracked bowl, and the cracks are then filled in with gold, and being able to not just bounce back, but bounce back even stronger than you were before, or better than you were before, was something that definitely spoke to me.
Yeah. I mean, this is just come out from all these conversations. When you have gone through this crucible and you come out the other end, just to take one element, the number of people that said, then people started coming out of the woodwork saying, hey, I'm going through it too. So just as a beacon of light, you are now a better person. But then you start tying in the empathy that you created because you've been in that dark place, and then your resilience, because now, instead of having the bucket overflowing or the bucket empty or whatever you want to use your analogy, now you're kind of back in a good place where you can actually process these calls again. So that is exciting to know that the James 2.0 or Kellie 2.0 is going to be even better than the one before you started struggling. Is the message I think that we should be telling people. It's not and I always point in this, and I know there are some anomalies that just cannot get past it, but the kind of poster child for the first responder with PTSD is a dude with a dog that goes around talking about how sad he is and he lives with his dog. That's not what we should be saying. We should be saying, the people that are out there saying, now I get to help other people with my story. And this is a lot of people that have been on the show. And again, like I said, I'm not trying to belittle people that just can't get past that element, but I just think they haven't found the right tools yet. Maybe, MDMA-led psychotherapy is the thing that you're missing, or maybe it's a dive retreat, or maybe it's the right partner. Who knows what it is? But I think seeing, like you said, the other side, that post-traumatic growth, that makes it exciting. It makes it worth the fight, and we are fighters. But if everyone that you see is kind of like, well, it's all sad and doom and gloom, how is that motivating you to find the courage to push through?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I, if you know who Jeff Orange is,
yeah,
that's something that we talk about a lot, is that we're kind of at a point in this whole movement where we're moving past awareness. We're moving past the time or the phase where it's important to, just hear the stories, for just that, coming out of the dark ages where people are just starting to talk about it and sharing their stories and sharing their trauma. And that's still important. And I don't want to diminish the value of people's stories. And because I think at some level, hearing somebody else's story oftentimes gives you sort of permission to be able to tell your own if and when you're ready. And that's critical. But in doing this work, we kind of are at a point where we've got to move away from just this basic awareness into the next phase of the mental wellness with first responders. And what does that really look like? What does the next phase, the next step, the next innovations, how are we going to continue to push this forward even more? And I think post-traumatic growth is a big part of that, but also looking at some of the things that we're doing with, like, Pasco County, with the these elements that are not new. It certainly isn't new science. Breathing and breath work's been around for since the beginning of life. But, if you look back into ancient times, right, they're using breath to moderate and mediate what they're going through in their lives. So bringing those elements into how can we send the message that mental wellness is a part of your operational readiness to be able to do this job and to be able to live and have a fulfilling life.
Absolutely. I want to hit one more area and then we'll go to some closing questions. But you mentioned earlier about educating at the chief level as well. I think, another elephant in the room, or we'll call it a different animal, the donkey in the room, is also organizational stress, organizational betrayal. And for example, a toxic culture where you're belittled if you talk about mental health, or that you're getting forced into mandatory overtime week in, week out. You're exhausted. You never get to go to home with your family. And that person's going home at 5 o'clock, seemingly uninterested in any sort of change. It's all the same kind of thing. So talk to me about what you've observed as far as the impact of organizational health or unhealth on mental health. And then what are the tools you're bringing to these organizations to try and turn that around?
So I'm really glad that you asked that question, because another bit of research that we're doing that I'm super excited about is looking at some elements of psychological safety in first responder organizations. And so we've done a recent survey where we've looked at psychological safety. We've looked at workplace incivility and institutional and administrative betrayal, the correlation between those concepts and things like PTSD and anxiety and depression. And so I got this idea to look at this based on the work, some of the work of Dr. Thomas Joyner, who's a great scholar in suicide, but he's done a couple of studies that have shown that for some first responders who've experienced traumatic events, it's not necessarily experiencing the trauma itself that has led to the development of PTSD symptoms. It is the organization's response to that person and to that trauma. And so the first time I read that, it was like a light bulb went off in my head, because I was like, wow, we can't change or we can't influence whether or not a first responder is going to have an exposure to trauma. It's just inherent in the nature of your work. But we can change how these organizations are responding to these things. So I was like, that's where we've got to go. If we're going to manipulate variables, let's change and control what we can, and we can change the culture. It's not an easy lift, but we can do it. So that was kind of where I got the idea to look at this. And so we looked at those three things, and we looked at them relative to PTSD, depression. I'm blanking off the top of my head the different elements that we looked at. But what was really surprising and exciting was that across the board, for everything that we examined, that we looked at, and we're hoping to publish this study soon, if we can get the paper written, finished writing the paper. Across the board, the more likely you were to be in what was considered a psychologically unsafe environment in your workplace, the more likely you were to have mental health concerns like depression, anxiety, PTSD. The same thing with workplace incivility. If you were more likely to experience workplace incivility, you were more likely to be struggling with those concerns. And the same thing with administrative or institutional betrayal. The more likely you were to have experienced those things on the job, the more likely you were to experience mental health issues. So of course, it's, correlation never establishes causality. We don't know that it's causing these things, but just to see these patterns in the data over and over again. And, we had a decent sample size. This was probably 1,500 first responders who participated in the study. So to just see that across the board, those same patterns was really exciting.
That's so good. I'm glad I asked that question, because that's amazing. The thing that, the stance that I have is, as you mentioned, you don't know if you're going to go on a rolled ankle or, 4 kids killed in the fire, like your husband. But what we can do is mitigate everything else. We can change fitness standards. We can change the work week. We can change the staffing, where we're fully staffed because we're actually taking care of people. And we can change the culture. We can change how people respond, because it's where how you choose your leaders and what you tolerate and what you don't tolerate in that culture, and the resources that are available, and the vulnerability and courage of those leaders to say, look, I go get help too. Actually, I've got one of the people told me recently, their chief has it in like the calendar that everyone can see. Chief's going to counseling today, that kind of thing. So to me, this is where we have to, really make the biggest push forward, is like, what can we control? We can control all those. If we can control all those, you just made a massive, massive impact. If we put PE programs in schools, got rid of the soda machines and served healthy food, and put recess back as well, we would have healthier children. We can't climb inside the child's brain and move their arms and legs, but I guarantee you change the environment, you're going to make a massive impact on childhood obesity and diabetes. It's no different with this. So it's so great to hear that there are actually some numbers that we can point to say, of course, again, it makes sense, but here are studies that back it up as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's some of the work that Dina and her crew are doing. They're looking at, more of the structural level interventions to help with suicide, to help prevent suicide, instead of placing the onus completely on the individual. What can we do structurally or a broad scale to make these changes to help make it so that we're creating a culture that prevents these things?
Yeah, exactly. Like I said, I mean, just the word suicide in Florida. I mean, we can think of, tens and tens and tens of names just this year. The way we do it right now isn't working. The way, drug prohibition isn't working. I mean, there are things that we've just got to draw a line in the sand and say enough is enough. We have to do things differently. So that being said, I want to kind of round off and go to some closing questions and be mindful of your time. The first one I love to ask, is there a book or are there books that you love to recommend? It can be related to our discussion today or completely unrelated.
Well, so I would say, one of my favorite fiction books that I read a while ago, I'll start with fiction, is The Time Traveler's Wife. So I always recommend that one when anybody recommends. But as far as content related, and I'll just say the reason I like that, did you ever watch the show Quantum Leap?
I did, yeah. I used to love
On
that show.
midday. I don't know why, but like people ask me, what's your favorite TV show of all time? Is Quantum Leap, man. I just loved that show. It was incredible. So I think that's why I like that book. Um, but I think if we're talking about books related to the work, Atomic Habits is a good one. Um, I should thinking off the top of my head, what else I would recommend. Is there a specific like problem or concern that
Any
is
book.
a
Could be a comic.
comic? Yeah, a graphic novel. So we're doing some work right now with programs for families, and we've got some neat stuff that we're putting out. We're putting out a coloring book, and we didn't have enough time to get to the graphic novel idea, but we were thinking about doing a graphic novel as well, like for the older kids, because the coloring book would be good for the younger kids, but we wanted to do a graphic novel for the older kids. So I'm blanking on any other books to recommend right now.
No, no problem at all. You gave me several. What about films and documentaries?
Films and documentaries. Are we talking about for the topic, or
I mean,
just things that I
anything.
like
Yeah,
to?
anything at all.
Um, so I think obviously, the well, I guess it's not really. I'm not sure if it's considered a documentary or more of a film, but I think in thinking back, one of them that really sticks out to me and influenced was Schindler's List. That was something that was very moving, and I was relatively young. I think I was a teenager when that came out. I don't, to be honest, I don't watch a ton of movies. Brandon, my husband, he's a huge movie buff and he goes to the movies a lot and he usually has to go alone. Or if he can convince our now 18-year-old son to go with him, he'll go. I'm trying to think of like the last time I saw a movie in the movie theater was probably, this is really going to tell you how long it's been, like Frozen, the first one with my son. So that's how long it's been since I've actually seen a movie in the movie theater.
I just saw a film called The Life of Chuck, and it's really interesting. It was the guy that did the Fall of the House of Usher, which I just finished watching that too. And he was formerly a horror director, and now that one is kind of pseudo, but it's a very human story. And then the Life of Chuck is an extremely like beautiful human story. So if you haven't seen one, you want something completely different that's profound that will leave you thinking. And it wasn't even in the main theater here. I had to go to one of the other theaters, but really, really good film. Totally different than anything you would have seen before.
Yeah, that's a good recommendation. I might take you up on that. It's like the same thing with, I think it's with reading. I don't do a lot of leisure reading just because I do so much reading for work. It's like when I'm not, reading for work, I'm doing other things. So I just don't read a lot outside of work.
I used to try and read every guest's book, and it just got too much because I might do 3 episodes a week now. So it was like, no,
Yeah.
I'll try and dip into it a little bit or scan through, or occasionally I'll read the whole thing. But yeah, same thing. When you do it over and over again, after a while, it kind of turns you off. So
Mhm. Yeah, and I think too, like as far as the big name, like Dina's book is out, and of course, Travis Howe's Create Your Own Light, his book, Taking Off the Cape by
Pat Kenny.
Chief Chief Kenny, he's wonderful, by the way, too. He just came and did our summit for us as our keynote, and he was amazing. There's a lot of good reads out there, I think, on this topic, and even more that are coming down the pipes. It's definitely a genre that I think's improved over the last 5 or 6 years.
Absolutely. Well, you mentioned Pat. He's been on the show a couple of times. Is there a person that you recommend to come on this podcast as a guest to speak to the first responders, military, and associated professions of the world?
Probably, but I might need some time to think about that. Yeah, Chief Kenny, he did such a good job at our summit. There wasn't a dry eye in the house. That was a new experience for me. I, of course, introduced him, and then I went up to the podium after his presentation was over. And I got up there and I stood and I looked out at the crowd, and I had never seen that many people at one time just with tears welling up in their eyes. It just kind of took me for a minute. I was like, wow, these people are all really moved. And of course I was too. So yeah, he's just fantastic.
Yeah, he told when I first talked to him. Sorry, now my dog's in the background going crazy. The first time that we chatted and I heard his full story about Sean, my wife and I were in the car. We were in St. Augustine Beach. I can still see it outside Kookaburra Coffee. And he's on the Bluetooth in my car and telling the story, and we're just like sobbing in this car park. So anyone walking by must have wondered what the hell these two crazy people were doing, crying side by side in a car. But yeah, he just has so much emotion in his voice, and he's just a beautiful storyteller as well.
Mm-hmm. Have you had Brendan McDonough on the show yet?
Yeah, we need to do another one.
Okay.
Actually, the Brothers Helping Brothers conference a couple of years ago. I'm actually doing it this year as well. He was one of the speakers, and I kind of hosted a live podcast. Yeah, he came on when Only the Brave came out as well. So yeah, we've known each other for quite a long time. But he's another amazing human.
Mm-hmm. He's one that really stood out to me. I've had the incredible opportunity to see a lot of speakers at a lot of different events, and there's a few that just really stick with you,
Yeah, absolutely. All right, well then the last question before we make sure everyone knows where to find you, what do you do to decompress if it's not reading?
No, definitely not reading. So I think for me, exercise is a big go-to. It's like a green flag and a red flag too. It's a green flag for me for I know when I'm in my routine and I'm doing something that I enjoy, and I'm able to be in a habit and a ritual that things are going well. It's a red flag too, because if I'm overdoing it, I can definitely feel it. But also if I'm starting to feel worn down, like I don't want to exercise, like it's more of a chore, then I know that I need to make some adjustments in other places. I think that spending time with my son has definitely become an outlet for me as he's gotten older. I've gotten less and less opportunity to do that. And now he's off to college. And so those moments are becoming even more rare, but even more cherished. So I think spending time with family, of course, spending time with Brandon, he's on shift work. So when we have the time together to do something that our whole family enjoys, a family outing, it's definitely something outside. We're water people. We're outdoors people. I love being on the water, salt water, preferably somewhere far offshore where you can't see land, and where maybe you even lose cell service for a while. And it's always nice when the weather stays fair when you're that far offshore. So yeah, just those types of things I enjoy.
Brilliant. Well, for people listening, I'm sure, people are interested about your work, maybe even want to reach out. Where are the best places to do that or find out more about you online?
So they can stop by our website at secondalarmproject.org, and it's second alarm with the two. So second alarm with the two.org. We also have a presence on social media. So you can find us on Facebook and on Instagram. I believe we were trying to get a LinkedIn page up. I'm not sure if that happened. I haven't checked it out for a while, but just your usual channels. If you want to check out UCF Restores webpage, you can check that out as well. That has all of our information and contact information. And we would really love to hear from people who are interested in training or services. So our funding, at least right now, is Florida based, although we do work with a lot of other states on some technical assistance and things like that. But the bulk of the work that we do is within Florida.
Brilliant. Well, I want to thank you so much. It's been such an amazing conversation. You have a very unique perspective coming from the firefighter family and then the research world, and then, creating literally a resource for our community. So thank you so much for taking the time and coming on the Behind the Shield podcast today.
Absolutely. It was my honor and privilege. It was so nice to finally get the chance to sit down and talk with you. I can't believe we've gone for almost 2 hours now. It's been a great conversation. And I just am really grateful and appreciate what you do and the message that you are able to share with the community. It's doing a lot of wonderful things. So thank you for what you do.